If you look in your bathroom cabinet right now, there is a very, very good chance you have a product that has castor oil in it.
Oh, absolutely. It is everywhere.
Right. I mean, it is in our soaps, our cosmetics, moisturizers. I think our grandparents used to actually drink it for stomach aches, which is wild to think about.
Yeah, the old traditional remedy.
Exactly. And it is completely, utterly harmless. But the waste product that is left behind when you manufacture that oil, it contains a biological toxin so perfectly lethal that a dose, like the size of a few grains of salt, will systematically shut down your entire body, cell by cell.
It really is one of the most staggering juxtapositions in nature, honestly. I mean, we cultivate the castor bean plant, which is Ricinus communis,
Yeah.
on a massive industrial scale all over the world.
Right. It is a huge cash crop.
Huge. Yet, hidden inside its industrial byproducts is a protein complex that, well, military scientists literally spent the entire Cold War trying to weaponize.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are taking you on this intensely focused journey into the mechanics of a microscopic assassin.
We really are. We have an incredibly diverse stack of sources spread out before us today.
Yeah, we are pulling from some pretty dense microbiological textbooks that outline cellular pathology, detailed medical toxicology reports, and honestly, some truly gripping true crime journalism coming straight out of Italy right now.
Our mission here is basically to completely deconstruct ricin.
Exactly. We need to understand its underlying biochemistry, like how it pulls off this intricate cellular sabotage, and then look at the absolute nightmare it presents to emergency room doctors who are just trying to diagnose it.
Right, because it is a nightmare. And finally, we will examine how modern forensic science actually reconstructs a poisoning when the murder weapon is essentially an invisible ghost.
So to ground all this heavy science, we're going to follow a framing narrative that the Italian press is calling the Giallo di Campobasso, the Campobasso Mystery.
It is a tragic case.
It really is. So I want you to picture a small, quiet Italian town called Piacatella. It is nestled in the Molise region. It is just after Christmas. And, you know, the holidays are supposed to be this time of family, food, celebrating.
Usually, yes.
But instead, a 50-year-old mother, Antonella Di and her 15-year-old daughter, Sarah Di Vita, they suddenly fall violently ill.
And what initially presents to everyone, including the doctors who first treated them, as this tragic, completely accidental case of severe food poisoning, it rapidly unravels.
Right. Because both the mother and the daughter pass away within days of each other.
Yeah. And when the final lab results come back, which took months, by the way, they do not find some mundane bacterial infection. They find a massive, deliberate dose of ricin.
Which is just, I mean, a public health tragedy morphs overnight into this complex locked room murder investigation.
Completely shifts the entire paradigm.
And the ultimate paradox that just blows my mind, the real hook of this entire case, is the source of this weapon. We are not talking about, like, synthesized plutonium or some rare venom extracted from an Amazonian tree frog.
No, not at all.
We're talking about a plant you probably have growing in your neighborhood as just an ornamental garden bush.
The castor plant is ubiquitous, mostly because of its large, striking, star-shaped leaves. People love it. It is beautiful, it is common, and its seeds harbor an astonishing destructive capability.
Wow. But to even begin to understand the crime scene in Pietro-Catella, we have to kind of transition from the police tape and zoom way, way into the microscope.
We really do.
Now, if you are listening to this, you are probably wondering, if this plant is growing in gardens everywhere and we literally rub castor oil on our skin, why aren't birds and squirrels and makeup users dropping dead all over the place?
That is the big question. And it comes down to the extraction process and the actual physical biology of the seed itself.
Okay, break that down for us.
So when industrial facilities press castor beans to extract the oil, the process involves immense heat and pressure.
Right.
That heat completely denatures the ricin protein. It unfolds the molecular structure of the toxin.
Like cooking an egg white. Right, it changes shape permanently.
That is a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
Yes, like cooking an egg. The heat renders the protein biologically inactive, so the oil that makes it to your bathroom cabinet is perfectly safe.
Okay, so the poison is literally just the industrial garbage left behind.
Exactly. In the agricultural industry, it is called the mash, or the pinello. It is the defatted, solid waste product of the seeds after the oil is pressed out.
And that is where the pure ricin toxin remains.
Right. Furthermore, the intact seed itself has a very hard, protective outer cuticle.
Like a shell.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If an animal, or even a human, were to accidentally swallow a whole unchewed castor bean, it would likely just pass right through the digestive tract without releasing any toxin into the bloodstream.
The armor of the seed basically keeps the poison locked away.
Yes. So to be lethal, that protective cuticle must be breached. The seed has to be thoroughly chewed, or the toxin must be chemically extracted and purified from the mash.
Which requires a lot of intent.
It absolutely requires intent. And once that purified toxin enters the human body, it initiates a cellular invasion that is, honestly, practically an evolutionary masterpiece.
Let's zoom all the way in then.
Yeah.
Because our sources detail this biological mechanism down to the molecular level. They classify ricin as a type 2 ribosome inactivating protein, or RIP2.
Yes, RIP2.
Right. And it is a 62 kilodalton protein made of two distinct chains, an A chain and a B chain, linked together by a single disulfide bond.
That disulfide bond is crucial.
Okay, so I was reading through the microbiology textbooks, and I kept picturing this like an elaborate corporate espionage operation.
Oh, I like that. How so?
Well, is it fair to say the B chain is the spy with the fake ID that gets through the factory doors, and the A chain is the actual saboteur carrying the sledgehammer?
That espionage analogy is actually perfect. But to really understand the devastation, let's look at how that spy actually gets past the guards.
Okay, tell me about the spy.
The B chain is what biochemists call a lectin.
A lectin.
Right. Lectins are specialized proteins that bind to carbohydrates. On the outer surface of almost all human cells, there are complex sugars called galactosides protruding outward, kind of like a forest.
Like molecular doorknobs.
Exactly like doorknobs. The B chain acts as a master key. It binds perfectly to these galactosides.
So it tricks the cell.
It does. The cell, sensing this interaction and basically believing it has encountered a harmless or even useful molecule, essentially opens its own door.
Oh, wow.
It engulfs the ricin molecule through a normal cellular process called endocytosis.
Endocytosis. Okay, so the cell just eats it.
Yeah, the cell membrane folds inward, swallows the toxin, and pinches off, placing the ricin inside a little internal transport bubble called an endosome.
So the cell has voluntarily brought the bomb inside its own walls.
It has, but the bomb hasn't detonated yet.
Right, because it's still in the bubble.
Exactly. Once inside, the endosome is shipped through the cell's internal transport network. It arrives at the Golgi apparatus, which functions as the cell's sorting and shipping center.
Like the mailroom.
The cellular mailroom.
Yeah.
From there, the ricin molecule does something highly unusual. It travels retrograde.
Retrograde, meaning backwards.
Yes, it moves backward against the usual flow of cellular traffic, sneaking deep into the endoplasmic reticulum, or the ER.
The ER, that is deep inside the fortified inner sanctum of the cell, right?
Very deep. And the ER is where the environment fundamentally shifts. Inside the ER, there are specific enzymes, like protein disulfide isomerase.
Okay, big words. What do those enzymes do?
Well, these enzymes inadvertently do the saboteur a massive favor. They break that single disulfide bond that is holding the A and B chains together.
Oh, so the spy detaches from the saboteur.
Precisely. The B chain has done its job of navigating the security checkpoints, and now it releases the A chain.
Okay, so what does the A chain do now that it is loose?
At this point, the A chain performs an incredible molecular magic trick.
A magic trick.
Yeah. See, the cell has a natural quality control garbage disposal system in the ER for misfolded proteins. It is called the ER-associated degradation pathway.
Okay, the garbage chute.
The A chain structurally disguises itself to look like a misfolded protein. It basically plays dead. It hijacks this disposal pathway to slip out of the ER and directly into cytosol.
Wait, the cytosol?
Yes, the main fluid interior of the cell.
So the saboteur is now just standing freely on the factory floor.
Exactly. And its only target is the ribosomes.
The ribosomes, those are the literal protein factories of the cell.
Yes. Every structure, every enzyme, every communication signal in a living cell depends on the constant production of new proteins. Without active ribosomes, the cell simply cannot sustain life.
So how does the saboteur break the factory? Because it doesn't just smash the whole thing to pieces, right?
No, and this is the most chilling aspect of the biochemistry. The A chain is a highly specific enzyme known as an N-glycosidase. It doesn't destroy the entire ribosome. It targets a highly specific loop on the 28S ribosomal RNA. It is known as the Ricin loop.
The Ricin loop.
Yes. Out of the thousands upon thousands of molecules that make up the ribosome, the A chain hunts down one single specific adenine base.
One base, adenine A4324, right.
Yes. The A chain chemically snips that single adenine base right out of the RNA backbone.
Just one tiny cut. It's like I mean, it's like sneaking into a massive automotive assembly line, bypassing all the heavy machinery and just removing the space bar from the master computer keyboard.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it.
Because the factory is still physically there, the workers are there, but the instructions suddenly read as just an unreadable continuous block of garbage text.
Exactly. That single missing base fundamentally alters the shape of the ribosome. It completely prevents elongation factors, which are the molecules that bring in new amino acids, from binding.
So the assembly line instantly halts.
Protein synthesis completely stops.
And the A chain doesn't just do this once and die, right?
No. Because the A chain is an enzyme, it acts as a catalyst. It isn't consumed in the reaction. A single ricin A chain molecule floating in the cytosol can depurinate or disable up to 1,500 ribosomes every single minute.
Wow, one molecule shutting down thousands of factories in a matter of minutes. That is devastatingly efficient.
It is terrifyingly efficient. Once protein synthesis stops, the cell cannot repair its membranes, it cannot produce energy, and it cannot maintain its basic life functions.
It basically starves.
But the damage doesn't end with silent starvation. The sources show that the cell, sensing this catastrophic cascading failure, triggers a process called apoptosis.
Right, programmed cell death. Like the cell realizes it has been irreparably compromised and just hits its own self-destruct button.
It launches a cascade of caspases and destructive enzymes that dismantle the cell from the inside out.
Oh, man.
And as these cells die, especially the immune cells like macrophages that might have actually swallowed the toxin while trying to clear it, they burst open,
Releasing all that garbage.
releasing massive amounts of inflammatory signals into the surrounding tissue. These are cytokines like TNF-alpha and interleukin-6.
Triggering a cytokine storm.
A localized, intense cytokine storm. So the body is essentially fighting a two-front war. You have a complete systemic failure of its cellular machinery, paired with massive, widespread inflammation and rapidly spreading tissue necrosis.
Which brings us to a massive clinical hurdle.
It is.
Because knowing how microscopic and surgical that cellular destruction is, well, it makes you wonder, if this toxin is so incredibly destructive, why can't doctors just spot it immediately? Like,
Right.
if I walk into an ER, I expect them to take some blood, run a scan, and just point to the problem. But ricin creates a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Hmm.
And the primary reason for that is the incubation delay.
Right, the delay between swallowing a poison and actually feeling sick.
Think about the microscopic journey we just detailed. The toxin has to bind to the cell surface.
Then endocytosis.
Right. Then move to the Golgi, travel retrograde to the ER, wait for the disulfide bond to break, hijack the degradation pathway to escape into the cytosol, and finally begin hunting down ribosomes one by one.
And all of those steps take biological time.
They do. Our toxicology sources state that if ingested, the symptoms take anywhere from 4 to 12 hours to appear.
4 to 12 hours. That gap is the killer's greatest advantage.
By the time the patient actually feels the first wave of nausea, by the time they register that something is wrong, the toxin is already well inside the cells.
The sabotage is entirely complete.
Yes. The body is just finally feeling the downstream systemic effects of millions of cellular factories simultaneously shutting down.
Let's talk about those symptoms, because this is where the profound tragedy of the Campobasso mystery really takes shape.
It really is tragic.
The initial symptoms of ingested ricin are intense nausea, vomiting, hemorrhagic diarrhea, and severe abdominal pain.
Very classic symptoms.
Right. Now, put yourself in that situation. If you walk into an emergency room on December 26th, right after a massive string of holiday dinners presenting with severe vomiting and diarrhea, I mean, every single doctor on earth is going to look at you and think food poisoning or a severe viral stomach bug.
They absolutely will, and honestly, medically speaking, they should.
Because the ricin is so rare.
Ricin poisoning is incredibly rare.
Yeah.
Bacterial or viral gastroenteritis is incredibly common. The clinical presentation of early-stage ricin ingestion perfectly, flawlessly mimics a severe gastrointestinal infection.
So there is no jagged white line on an X-ray pointing to a biological weapon.
None.
And this exact diagnostic trap is what snared the medical staff at the Cardarelli Hospital in Campobasso.
Yes, Antonella and Sarah went to the hospital with these exact symptoms.
The doctors evaluated them, saw classic signs of acute gastroenteritis, and treated them for what they reasonably believed was a severe stomach bug.
They administered 5 fluids to combat dehydration, observed them, and eventually discharged them to recover at home.
Because of that initial discharge, 5 doctors at the Cardarelli Hospital were actually initially placed under formal investigation for manslaughter by the authorities.
Which is just awful.
Oh.
The legal system looked at 2 sudden deaths from suspected food poisoning and immediately assumed gross medical negligence.
Which is horrifying for those doctors because, I mean, even if they had possessed the clairvoyance to suspect ricin, there was literally nothing they could have done differently at that stage, right?
That is the cold, terrifying reality of clinical toxicology. There is no FDA-approved antidote for ricin poisoning.
No antidote at all.
None. There are preventative vaccines in development, but those require administration before exposure. Once the A chain is loose inside the cytosol of the cells, the war is already lost.
So the medical treatment is purely 100% supportive.
Purely supportive.
So they just try to artificially keep the patient's body running while hoping the immune system can somehow weather the storm.
Exactly. They provide aggressive intravenous fluids to combat the massive, life-threatening dehydration caused by the hemorrhagic diarrhea.
Right.
If the lungs begin to fail due to systemic inflammation, they use mechanical ventilation. They administer vasopressors to force the blood pressure up as the vascular system begins to collapse.
Wow.
If a doctor somehow knew about the ingestion within the first hour or two, they might attempt a gastric lavage, which is bumping the stomach, or administer activated charcoal to bind the toxin in the gut.
But after 12 hours.
After 12 hours, the toxin is entirely integrated into the organs.
And to make the doctor's jobs even more impossible, ricin is essentially a ghost toxin. It is incredibly difficult to detect in routine hospital blood work.
Routine metabolic panels and complete blood counts will show blaring sirens of organ stress.
Like what?
The doctors will see elevated white blood cell counts indicating severe inflammation. They will see spiking liver enzymes. They will see rapidly rising BUN and creatinine levels, which indicates the kidneys are shutting down.
But none of those tests will show the ricin protein itself.
Exactly. Ricin clears from the circulating bloodstream very rapidly because it binds so tightly and efficiently to the solid tissues it is destroying. The liver, the spleen, the kidneys.
Okay, so if a routine blood test cannot see it, how does a toxicologist actually prove it is ricin? Like, how did they finally break the Campobasso case?
Well, when you cannot find the footprint of the killer, you look for the footprints of the killer's companion.
The companion.
Yes. When the ricin protein is extracted from the castor bean mash, another chemical compound comes along for the ride. It is a small alkaloid called ricinine.
Ricinin. So ricin is the massive, deadly protein complex, and ricinine is the little alkaloid hitchhiker.
Precisely. Ricinine isn't the compound causing the cellular destruction, but its presence in the body is the definitive biological receipt that proves you ingested castor bean extract.
Because they come from the same plant.
Right. And because ricinine is a much smaller molecule, it can be tracked in the urine or blood for up to 48 hours, and even longer in solid tissues.
How do they find it?
To find it, toxicologists use highly sensitive mass spectrometry techniques, specifically liquid chromatography with tandem mass spectrometry, or LC-MS-MS.
Let's break that down for the listener. Mass spectrometry is essentially a highly advanced molecular sorting machine, right?
You can think of it as a chemical fingerprint scanner combined with a microscopic scale.
Okay, I like that.
The liquid chromatography part separates the complex mixture of blood or urine into individual chemical components. Then, the mass spectrometer blasts those components with ions, breaking them apart and measuring the exact mass and charge of the fragments.
Like smashing a vase to see what kind of clay it is made of.
Exactly. Every molecule shatters into a specific identifiable pattern. If the machine detects the exact molecular weight and fragmentation pattern of ricinine, it flags a positive result.
But, and this is the absolute kicker that delayed justice in Pietracatella, a hospital lab only runs that highly specialized, incredibly expensive mass spectrometry test if they already suspect ricin.
Right. You have to program the machine with the exact fingerprint you are looking for.
And in the Campobasso case, because it looked so much like routine food poisoning, nobody thought to look for ricining.
Nobody at all. It took the experts at the Pavia Poison Center, which is one of the premier, highly specialized toxicology facilities in all of Italy, 3 solid months to finally process the samples and identify the ricinine biomarker.
3 months. That is 3 months where the investigation was flying entirely blind, focusing on the innocent hospital doctors.
Completely misdirected.
So 3 months later, the lab results finally drop. The Pavia Poison Center confirms the presence of the ricinine biomarker. The investigation instantly pivots. The manslaughter charges against the doctors are dropped, and a homicide investigation is officially launched.
And this is where the real detective work begins.
Right. But if the toxin hides so perfectly and the symptoms are delayed by hours, how do investigators work backward from a December 28th death to figure out when a completely invisible poison was slipped into someone's food?
The timeline is always the most crucial and often the most deliberately confusing element of any poisoning investigation.
Because of that latent incubation period.
Exactly. The moment the victim clutches their stomach is deeply decoupled from the moment the killer handed them the drink.
So let's track the shifting timeline in Campobasso. Initially, because the illness spiked right around the holidays, investigators naturally assumed the poisoning happened at the family's Christmas Eve dinner, or perhaps the dinner on December 23rd.
Right, that was the working theory.
The mother and daughter got sick, went to the hospital, were discharged, returned home, and then they rapidly deteriorated. They both died days later, around December 27th and 28th.
So the initial working hypothesis was a single massive fatal dose hidden in a holiday meal. It fits the classic murder mystery narrative.
But the precise toxicology results from Pavia threw a massive, undeniable wrench into that theory.
They absolutely did.
The blood tests revealed ricin levels up to 250 times the lethal threshold. 250 times.
We really need to heavily contextualize that number.
Please do.
The generally accepted lethal dose of ricin for an adult human via injection is roughly 0.2 milligrams per kilogram of body weight.
Which is microscopic.
Right. Oral ingestion does require a higher initial dose because the harsh stomach acid and digestive enzymes break down a portion of the protein before it can be absorbed by the intestines.
Okay, makes sense.
But a 250 times concentration persisting in the blood, I mean, that is an astronomical, unfathomable amount of pure toxin.
If the lethal dose is a grain of salt, we are talking about consuming a handful of the stuff. That is not accidentally swallowing a poorly chewed seed. That is a deliberate, overwhelming chemical assault.
It is massive overkill. But more importantly for the detectives, finding that extraordinarily high a concentration in the blood samples taken right around the time of death, well, it raised a glaring mechanical red flag for the toxicologists and the Loreno prosecutor's office.
Because, as you explained earlier, ricin clears the circulating bloodstream very quickly to bind to the organs.
Precisely.
So if they were poisoned only once on December 23rd, by the time they died on the 27th or 28th, the active blood levels should have been much, much lower.
Finding active, record-breaking levels of the toxin in the blood right before death strongly suggests to the scientific mind that the exposure did not begin and end on December 23rd.
Which leads directly to the terrifying new hypothesis the prosecutors introduced: prolonged, repeated exposure.
The forensic theory evolved. Antonella and Sarah were likely not just poisoned once at a holiday dinner.
They may have been subjected to repeated, escalating doses.
Yes. Perhaps an initial dose on the 23rd caused the intense gastrointestinal illness that sent them to the Cardarelli Hospital in the first place.
But when they were discharged and returned to the supposed safety of their own home to rest,
they were dosed again and again.
So while they were lying in bed, weak, vulnerable, recovering from what they thought was a terrible stomach bug, someone in that very house was continually feeding them massive amounts of a biological weapon in their tea, their soup, their water.
That repeated exposure perfectly explains the rapid, catastrophic acceleration into multi-organ failure.
Because their bodies were already so weakened.
The liver and kidneys were already deeply compromised and fighting widespread inflammation from the first wave of cellular destruction. The subsequent massive doses completely overwhelmed their depleted cellular defenses,
leading to irreversible shock.
Yes, vascular collapse and death within hours of the final administrations.
It is deeply chilling. But before the police can lock someone up for murder, they have to conclusively prove this wasn't just a bizarre, tragic household accident.
Right, you have to rule that out.
Because castor plants are common. Could the dog have dragged something in? Could they have accidentally contaminated their own food?
The investigators had to mathematically and scientifically rule out an accident. Accidental ricin poisonings do happen globally, but they are incredibly rare, and crucially, they are very rarely fatal.
Because our toxicology sources note that human fatalities from accidental castor bean ingestion hover around 1.5%.
Yes, 1.5%.
Because you would have to physically chew a large handful of incredibly bitter, unpleasant seeds, which goes against every human reflex.
Right. Most accidental poisonings happen with pets. specifically dogs eating organic bone meal fertilizers that use poorly processed castor mash as an ingredient.
Oh, wow.
But to get a 250 times lethal dose of pure active toxin into two adult humans without them instantly noticing the bitter taste or the gritty texture of crushed seeds, that requires intentional chemical extraction.
The killer did not just pick a leaf from the garden and chop it into a salad. They had to scientifically bypass the protective cuticle of the seed entirely.
The forensic investigation revealed that the poison was homemade. This wasn't a dark web purchase where someone bought military-grade, weaponized white powder. This was artisanal.
Artisanal ricin. That requires someone setting up a miniature, clandestine chemistry lab in their kitchen or garage.
It requires patience, a baseline understanding of chemistry, and intense premeditation.
Walk us through what that actually looks like.
Well, to extract ricin at home, the perpetrator has to physically shell the seeds, crush the inner endosperm into a paste, and use a chemical solvent, commonly something like acetone or petroleum ether. This separates the harmless fats and castor oils from the lethal proteins.
Okay.
Then they have to carefully filter the mixture and precipitate the active protein out of the solution. It is a meticulous multi-step process.
And it is highly dangerous to the person making it. Like, if they accidentally inhale the dried protein dust during the filtering process, they could easily kill themselves.
Which tells the behavioral profilers two critical things.
Okay, what are they?
1, the perpetrator was highly determined. And 2, they likely had undisturbed time, space, and privacy to execute this process without being questioned.
Which turns the Campobasso case into a classic locked room mystery.
The artisanal, time-consuming nature of the poison strongly indicated an inside job.
It points to someone who not only had the time and privacy to extract the poison, but also had undisturbed, repeated, trusted access to the victim's food, their drinks, their daily utensils.
Because if the prolonged exposure theory is correct, the killer was living in the house with them after they got back from the hospital.
So the house in Pietracatella was immediately sequestered by the authorities. It basically became ground zero.
It did. The Italian forensics team, the Scientifica, scoured every inch of that home.
But they weren't looking for a bloody knife or a blunt object?
No, they were looking for invisible protein traces. They swabbed kitchen counters, sink traps, blenders, and coffee pots.
Looking for what?
Looking for microscopic traces of castor bean dust or residual acetone solvent. They were trying to prove the exact vector of ingestion. Was it dissolved in the water jug? Mixed into a cold soup?
You mentioned cold soup. Does temperature matter here? Because if the industrial heat of making castor oil destroys the toxin, wouldn't putting it in a hot coffee or boiling soup do the exact same thing?
That is an excellent, highly technical point. Yes, prolonged exposure to boiling temperatures will denature ricin.
Okay.
However, if the extracted toxin is stirred into a beverage that is nearly warm or added to food after it has been cooked and is cooling on the plate, the protein remains entirely lethal. The Scientifica needed to find the contaminated utensil to understand exactly how the killer bypassed the heat problem.
But if the physical evidence is microscopic, easily washed down a drain, or wiped away with a sponge, how do you actually catch the killer? You cannot just run a fingerprint check on a molecule.
When the physical trail goes cold, or is literally microscopic, modern investigators pivot. They turn to the digital trail.
Let's look at the surviving family members then. The father, Gianni DeVito, was rigorously tested by authorities. His toxicology reports came back completely negative for any trace of ricin or ricinine.
Which is a crucial data point for the detectives. Living in the exact same house, eating presumably similar meals prepared in the same kitchen, but showing absolutely zero biological exposure.
Then there is the older surviving daughter, Alice, who is 19. She quickly became a focal point of the investigation.
She did.
Investigators seized her iPhone 14. What exactly are digital forensics teams looking for on a smartphone in a complex biological poisoning case like this?
A smartphone is essentially a deeply intimate, unerasable diary of a person's intent.
That's a good way to put it.
The digital forensics experts aren't just reading through recent text messages. They're extracting a full forensic image of the device's memory banks.
Wow.
They're pulling GPS location data to verify daily alibis and movements. They are recovering deleted WhatsApp chats spanning back 5 months to establish family dynamics, hidden conflicts, and potential motives.
But most importantly, they are scraping the deepest layers of the web search history.
Because you do not just wake up one morning inherently knowing how to perform a multi-step chemical extraction of plant proteins using acetone.
Right, you have to research it.
The forensics team is looking for specific queries. Searches about castor beans, lethal toxicity thresholds, chemical extraction methods using common household solvents.
Or even morbid searches about how long ricin takes to show symptoms after ingestion.
Exactly. If a suspect was Googling how to extract ricin a week before their family suddenly contracted severe gastroenteritis, well, that is the digital equivalent of holding a smoking gun over a body.
But investigations unfolding in real time are inherently messy, and our sources highlight several intense contradictions that actually emerged during this phase.
Yes, there were some major conflicts in the evidence.
For instance, there were early leaks to the Italian press suggesting that traces of ricin were actually found in Antonella's hair.
Yes, and the defense lawyer for the family fiercely, publicly denied this leak.
Why?
He stated on the record that there were no traces in the hair whatsoever, and he used that specific detail to push back against the prosecutor's repeated dose theory.
Why does the hair matter so much to the legal defense? We already know the massive 250 times dose was found in the blood.
It comes down to the pharmacokinetics of how toxins are stored in the body and how that impacts the legal timeline.
Okay, explain that.
Hair grows slowly, roughly 1 centimeter a month. When a systemic toxin enters your bloodstream, a tiny fraction of it gets deposited into the hair follicle at the scalp and is permanently locked into the keratin of the hair shaft as it grows outward.
Like tree rings recording a drought.
Exactly like tree rings. Finding ricin deep in the hair shaft would conclusively prove chronic, long-term poisoning occurring over weeks or even months prior to December.
It would mean the killer had been slowly, methodically dosing them for a very long time.
Right. However, finding it only in the active blood supply suggests a sudden, massive, acute attack over a compressed period of a few days.
So if the defense lawyer is right and the hair is completely clean, it supports a narrative of a sudden, acute attack.
Perhaps a crime of passion, a sudden break in psychology, rather than a cold, months-long calculated plot.
It changes the psychological profile of the crime entirely in the eyes of a jury.
It really does. It is the vast legal difference between a sudden explosion of violence, even if executed with an artisanal poison, and a cold, calculated, long-term torture campaign.
To give everyone listening some broader context on how rare and bizarre this specific biological weapon is, let's look at a couple of other famous ricin cases detailed in our sources.
I think that really helps highlight just how uniquely complex the Campobasso case is.
The classic textbook historical example that every toxicologist studies is the 1978 assassination of Georgy Markov in London.
Ah, yes, the infamous umbrella murder.
Exactly. Markov was a prominent Bulgarian dissident writer. While he was waiting for a bus on Waterloo Bridge, a man walked past him, casually dropped an umbrella, and apologized.
Markov felt a sharp, minor sting in his thigh. That night, he developed a sudden, severe fever, and he died 3 days later in the hospital.
And during the autopsy, the pathologist found a tiny, highly engineered metallic pellet embedded in his leg.
A platinum iridium pellet, engineered with microscopic, perfectly drilled holes containing roughly 500 micrograms of pure ricin.
So tiny.
It was a classic, highly sophisticated Cold War KGB-style assassination. But notice the vector of administration: injection.
Right, injection.
Injection completely bypasses the harsh environment of the digestive system. It means a microscopic dose is virtually guaranteed to be lethal, and the rapid onset of systemic cellular failure is much more predictable.
That was state-sponsored terrorism with unlimited budgets. But our sources also detail a much more recent, amateur, but honestly equally terrifying case from Turin in 2019.
In the Turin case, 4 young men essentially set up a clandestine biological lab in a residential garage.
Just a garage.
They bought untreated castor seeds online and used internet video tutorials to extract the ricin.
Their motive was incredibly petty too, right? One of them wanted to poison a rival in a teenage love triangle.
Which is absolutely insane. Setting up a bioweapons lab over high school drama.
But they failed to kill him.
They did fail. And they failed because they lacked a fundamental basic understanding of chemistry. Ricin is a protein. It is highly water-soluble, but it does not dissolve well in high-proof alcohol.
So they put it in his drink.
The teenagers tried to slip their homemade ricin extract into the victim's vodka glass at a party.
So instead of dissolving invisibly, the protein powder just clumped up and sank to the bottom of the glass.
Exactly. The intended victim noticed the strange, gritty sludge at the bottom of his drink and stopped drinking before consuming the lethal dose.
Wow.
The police eventually investigated, raided the garage, and found a fully functioning, highly dangerous, albeit amateur biological weapons lab.
So on one end of the spectrum, you have the KGB engineering microscopic platinum pellets. On the other end, you have clumsy teenagers failing basic solubility chemistry.
And now, tragically, the Campobasso mystery sits somewhere right in the middle.
A domestic, intimate setting, a massive, successfully administered dose, and a locked room investigation heavily reliant on digital forensics to cut through the diagnostic muddy waters.
It perfectly highlights how the democratization of scientific information on the internet has radically changed the landscape of forensic science.
The weapon is ancient, biological, and microscopic, but the evidence that will likely solve the case and secure a conviction is modern and purely digital.
Exactly.
Wow. Let's zoom out and summarize the incredible, terrifying journey we have been on today.
We covered a lot of ground.
We started by looking at a ubiquitous, harmless garden plant, the castor bean. We traced how its industrial waste product harbors a molecular assassin, a protein that acts like a microscopic saboteur sneaking past our cells' security.
Hijacking our internal transport systems.
Right. And systematically destroying the ribosomal factories that keep us alive by sniping out a single vital chemical base.
We examined how that microscopic cellular destruction manifests as an absolute diagnostic maze for emergency room doctors.
Perfectly mimicking a common stomach bug, exploiting an incubation delay, and leaving virtually no trace in standard hospital blood work.
And finally, we look at how this ancient biological mechanism was brought into a modern locked room murder mystery in a quiet Italian town.
Forcing investigators to rely on digital footprints, mass spectrometry, and shifting timelines to prove that a massive 250 times lethal dose wasn't a tragic accident.
But a calculated artisanal chemical assault.
It is a profound, unsettling collision of ancient botany, complex cellular biology, and modern digital criminology.
It really is.
And that brings me to a final provocative thought I want to leave you with today as we wrap up this deep dive.
Okay, what is it?
We heavily classify ricin as a Category B bioterrorism agent. Governments around the world spend millions of dollars monitoring for it.
They do?
Yet, the literal blueprints to extract it from a plant growing in thousands of ordinary gardens are scattered freely and entirely unprotected across the internet.
That is the frightening reality.
As digital forensics become more and more advanced at catching killers after the fact, recovering deleted searches, tracking GPS, finding traces on a hard drive, are we fundamentally, structurally unequipped as a society to stop these biological open-source weapons before they strike our own dinner tables?
If the chemical knowledge is ubiquitous and the biological material is ubiquitous, the only remaining barrier to entry is human intent.
And intent is the hardest thing in the world to predict or regulate.
It really is.
It is definitely enough to make you look twice at the salad bar. But more importantly, it reminds us that the diagnostic landscape isn't just muddy waters. Sometimes it is hiding a shark.
Very true.
We thought we were looking at a standard clean X-ray of a simple broken bone, a routine case of food poisoning, only to realize the machine couldn't see the true microscopic damage until it was far, far too late. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, keep asking the hard questions, and we will see you next time.